Jack Miller lived a routine so predictable that even the desert wind seemed to know the exact time he lit his cigarette. At 58 years old, owner of a small workshop on the edge of Highway 89, in the arid heart of Arizona, he was a man who no longer expected great surprises from life. Breakfast always at 6, the first engine disassembled at 7, the same radio crackling on the workbench since the days when people still believed sound travelled better through dry air. Jack fixed Hunter's pickups, old trucker's radio, and every now and then, he stared at the horizon without knowing exactly what he was looking for. Since his wife had passed away, the world had shrunk for him. The radio, the coffee, and the silence formed an invisible triangle where life held steady and unmoving. At night, when the desert cooled and the wind swept dust across the windows, Jack would sit on the wooden bench beside the CB radio, twist the frequency dial, and listen only to the static, that empty sound that, in some way, filled the voids inside him. It was the only voice that still accompanied him. But that night, the silence didn't come. The clock struck 2 in the morning when the static changed tone. Amid the electrical pops, something new emerged, a short sequence of sounds, almost like fragmented syllables, repeated in a pattern that didn't seem human. Jack frowned, turned the tuning knob, and pressed his ear to the speaker. The sound grew louder and faded, as if someone were trying to speak through a world of interference. Then, the sky split open. A blue light pierced the horizon, slicing through the darkness with impossible precision. It was silent, but so intense that the air seemed to vibrate, as if the desert itself were breathing with it. A few seconds later, a muffled rumble echoed in the distance, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. Jack stood frozen, the cigarette burning between his fingers, his heart racing, and a strange sensation in his chest, as if, for the first time in a long while, something was calling to him. He didn't know what it was, or why, but he felt it with absolute clarity. That night would not be like the others. The radio continued to emit the mysterious sounds, growing clearer by the moment, and the wind seemed to whisper something he couldn't translate. Jack rose slowly, looked toward the horizon still stained by the blue light, and without realizing it, took a step forward, the first step in a journey that would change everything he thought he knew about loneliness, faith, and the meaning of being alive. Driven more by instinct than courage, Jack grabbed the flashlight and the old truck. The engine grumbled, coughed a few times, and finally caught, as if it too knew that night was different. The dirt road leading to the old quarry seemed darker than ever, and the headlights barely cut through the dust kicked up by the wheels themselves. The radio, which he'd left on out of habit, continued to broadcast the same pattern of sounds, now stronger, closer, as if the signal were guiding him. Jack's heart beat in a strange rhythm. He wasn't afraid, but he felt an ancient tension, the same flutter in his stomach he'd known as a young man, when everything in the world seemed like an invitation to the unknown. The blue light, in the distance, flickered at irregular intervals, reflecting off the rocks and revealing the path to the abandoned. The place, deserted for decades, held the silence of forgotten things, and now it seemed to harbour something. When the headlights finally illuminated the quarry's interior, Jack braked hard. Before him, half buried in the sand, was a metallic structure, rounded and still smoking. Small lights blinked around it, pulsing in a slow, almost hypnotic rhythm. Jack stepped down from the truck slowly, the flashlight trembling in his hand. It wasn't a plane, nor a helicopter, and certainly not anything he could identify. He approached, the wind whistling through the rocks. Then, he noticed movement. Among the wreckage, something stirred. A small, hunched body, breathing with difficulty. Jack swallowed hard, hesitated, but the sound from the radio, that same pattern of sounds that had led him there, seemed to respond to the movement. He took another step, and the blue light intensified. The being raised its head, and for an instant, their eyes met. They were large, moist, filled with something profoundly human, pain, fear, and desperation. Jack felt the same impulse that drove him to rescue an injured animal at the roadside. "Easy," he murmured, his voice hoarse and trembling. "I won't hurt you." He extended his hand, and the being stopped moving. It seemed to understand. Jack knelt, and with care, gathered it in his arms. The body was light, cold, but there was a faint warmth pulsing somewhere, a blue glow beneath the greyish skin. He carried it to the truck, settled it on the seat, and covered it with his jacket. The radio, silent for a few, crackled back to life. But this time, the sound was different. It was the same pattern, only clearer, more rhythmic. Jack realized it wasn't noise. It was a message, a plea for help. As he drove back to the workshop, with the being unconscious beside him, Jack couldn't stop thinking one thing. Why had that plea come to him? A forgotten man on a forgotten road. Maybe, he thought, fate had found a strange way to remind him that there was still something inside him capable of answering someone's call, even if that someone came from a place he couldn't comprehend. If this story is already touching you, take a moment now to subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments what you would do if an unknown being knocked on your door asking for help. Your interaction helps spread this message to more people. The workshop, in that early morning, seemed more alive than ever. The clock read 3:42 when Jack entered, carrying the light body of the visitor. He laid it on a clean blanket spread across the workbench where engines and old tools once lay. The being breathed with difficulty, its movements slow, and the blue glow beneath its skin flickered like a weak flame. Jack fetched a damp cloth, moistened the creature's parched lips, and waited. He didn't know what to do, but he felt he couldn't abandon it. For a moment, he considered calling someone, maybe the sheriff, maybe a hospital, but something inside him stopped him. He feared the visitor would be treated as a threat, not as someone in need of help. So, he decided to act the only way he knew how, by caring for it. He cleaned the wounds, covered it with warmed cloths, and watched in silence. When he stepped away to fetch water, he heard a snap. The radio, which had been off, turned on by itself. The same pattern of sounds filled the space again. But this time, something new happened. The workshop lights flickered, and on the opposite wall, a projection of images appeared, like reflections dancing in the air. Jack turned slowly and stood motionless, watching. For a few seconds, he saw scenes that made no sense but spoke directly to his heart. A white desert like ice, circular structures made of pale stone, children running among golden lights, and then chaos, fire, darkness, noises of something breaking, screams that didn't come from the throat, but from the soul. The projection ended abruptly, and the being collapsed, exhausted, as if each image had drained its last strength. Jack rushed to it and held it, feeling the body shudder. There were no words, but the message was clear. This wasn't an invader, it was someone who had lost everything, an exile from some distant place, carrying in its eyes the same pain Jack had carried in his chest since his wife's death, the loss of home. Through the rest of the early morning, Jack improvised what he could, adjusted the blanket, prepared some soup, and kept the space warm with the old oil heat. With each touch, the creature's body responded with soft pulses of light, as if to say, "Thank you." As he watched the visitor sleep, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the need to care. Not out of obligation, but from an almost sacred impulse. He realized that, in some way, this encounter wasn't chance, that perhaps, in the midst of a forgotten desert, two solitudes had met to remind each other that there was still something good in the world. Outside, the wind blew fiercely, sweeping Highway 89. Inside the workshop, only the radio's sound filled the space, repeating a pattern of sounds that no longer seemed like noise. To Jack, it was almost like a prayer, a wordless conversation between two beings who, from worlds so distant, had finally understood each other. The following days dragged slowly, as if time had surrendered to the mystery now inhabiting the workshop. Jack kept the doors closed, avoiding curious passers-by on the road. The visitor remained lying on the same blanket, eyes half open, breathing labored but alive. The blue glow emanating from its body was now constant, though softer, almost rhythmic, like the beat of a heart. Jack had retrieved an object from the wreckage, something like a metallic cylinder the size of a human arm. Unlike any technology he knew, the object pulsed, emitting a low, continuous hum like the whisper of living energy. He kept it on the table, observing it with the same reverence one might give to something sacred. Sometimes the visitor would reach toward the object, and the glow from both, the being and the cylinder, would intensify, as if they were conversing in silence. One morning, the being seemed to awaken fully. It tried to sit up, pointed to the object, then to the sky, and finally touched Jack's chest. In that instant, a flood of images overwhelmed his mind. He saw ships in flight, beings like this one being hunted, children hidden in underground shelters, planets ravaged by darkness. The visions were quick but full of emotion. There was fear, but also hope, and above all, an appeal. Save this. Jack fell to his knees, gasping, tears streaming down without him noticing. He understood, even without words, that the object was vital, perhaps a power source, perhaps a seed, something carrying the future of those who remained of that people. The visitor wasn't fleeing, it was protecting something. That night, Jack sat beside it for hours. The being seemed to weaken with each passing moment, but its eyes held the same serenity. Jack took the cylinder in his hands and held it carefully, feeling the warmth pulse through the metal. "I don't know who you are," he said, his voice choked, "or why you came to me. But if you chose me, if you trusted me, it's because you believed I wouldn't be afraid." The visitor slowly raised its hand and placed it on Jack's chest. The touch was light, but the impact was profound. An intense heat coursed through him, and for the first time in years, he cried without shame, without restraint. He cried for his wife's loss, for the silent dawns, and now, for this being who, even on the brink of death, still conveyed gratitude to him. In that moment, Jack understood that what had happened wasn't coincidence. It was a destined encounter, and that perhaps the universe found its own ways to unite two lonely hearts, even if they came from different worlds. The days grew silent. The workshop, which once echoed with the noise of engines and tools, was now merely a shelter for two existences that seemed to be bidding each other farewell. The visitor's body grew weaker by the hour. The blue glow, which once lit the floor and walls, now flickered in pale tones, like a candle about to go out. Jack did what he could, kept the heater on, brought warm water, spoke simple words just to fill the space with something other than the sound of parting. Sometimes, the being tried to respond. It would lift its gaze, move its fingers, emit short, soft sounds like whispers of wind. Jack didn't understand the word, but he felt what they carried. Gratitude, a silent, immense gratitude. In the early hours of a Saturday, the visitor opened its eyes and fixed them on Jack. With effort, it pointed to the metallic object, then to Jack's chest, and finally to the sky. The gesture was clear. It wanted Jack to return it to where it came from. It was time to fulfill the purpose. Jack held its hand, feeling it cold but still alive. "I will," he said, his voice nearly breaking. "I promise." The visitor tried to smile, an almost imperceptible smile. Then, it raised its other hand and touched Jack's chest again. A blue flash flooded the workshop. Jack felt the heat course through his body like an electric current that didn't hurt but purify. He closed his eyes instinctively, and for a moment, everything was silent. When he opened them, the flash had vanished. The body was no longer there. On the blanket remained only the metallic cylinder, pulsing with renewed intensity. Jack knelt, brought a hand to his face, and wept, not from fear, nor confusion, but from a pain that only those who love without understanding can feel. With the dawn, he walked into the desert, carrying the object with him. The sky still bore traces of the blue from the early morning, and the wind blew lightly, as if accompanying his steps. Behind the workshop, he dug a small hole and placed the cylinder inside. Over it, he set a large stone and murmured, "You didn't come in vain." In the nights that followed, Jack began to notice something different. When the sun set and the desert plunged into darkness, small lights appeared on the horizon. They moved slowly, silently, and stopped exactly above the spot where the object had been buried. They lingered there, motionless, like sentinels. Jack would sit on the porch, watching. He felt the place was no longer empty, that the visitor, in some way, remained there, watching over, and perhaps, also, reminding him that loneliness is only real until the moment we choose to help someone. After that, the heart is never the same. Months passed. Jack's routine returned little by little, or at least part of it. He still repaired engines and changed tires for travelers, but something in his gaze had changed. Sometimes, while pouring coffee into the old tin mug, his eyes would drift to the horizon where the desert met the sky. He seemed to be waiting for something, and in a way, he was. In a silent early morning, the radio crackled. Jack lifted his eyes from the counter, already accustomed to the sound. But this time, the pattern was different. Not the same plea for help. It was calmer, more spaced out, almost like a heartbeat. He turned off the workshop light, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped out. The air was cold, and the silence thick. In the sky, the lights returned. First one, then another, until dozens hovered over the desert. They were the same as before, small, blue, floating silently. Jack felt his chest tighten. The lights began to move, slowly forming a perfect circle. Then, one descended. The ground trembled lightly as the craft landed a few meters away. Jack remained still, unafraid, overcome only by a profound calm. The hatch opened, and three beings emerged. They were smaller than the first visitor, but similar. The same moist eyes, the same soft, almost peaceful aura. One of them carried in its hands the metallic cylinder Jack had buried months before. Jack took a step forward, heart pounding. The being approached slowly, placed the cylinder on the ground, and touched its chest with its hand. The same gesture the other had made. The object pulsed, projecting a bluish light that illuminated the surrounding desert. In that light, an image formed before them. Jack and the first visitor, side by side, under the same sky. He didn't understand how, but he understood the meaning. It was a thank you, a silent tribute to compassion, a gesture from afar that had crossed impossible distances to say only, "We remember." Jack stood still, eyes welling up, unable to say anything. The being turned to him, repeated the chest-touch gesture, and pointed to the sky. The word that echoed from the radio, clear and soft, sounded in English, but carried something greater than language. Alliance. The lights began to rise slowly, one by one, until they vanished among the stars. Jack remained there, alone, heart light and hands trembling. He looked at the spot where the cylinder had been, and noticed the ground now emitted a faint glow, as if the desert were breathing light. For a long time, he stayed silent. Then, he smiled. Not because he understood everything, but because he knew, deep down, that this gesture needed no explanation. Sometimes, life boils down to this. Someone asks for help, another responds, and from that simple choice, a bridge between worlds is born. After that night, Jack never felt alone again. The lights continued to return from time to time, as if the sky had learned the way to him. Sometimes they were just distant points, nearly mistaken for stars. Other times, they appeared closer, softly illuminating Highway 89, where the workshop still stood against time. Jack no longer awaited them with anxiety, but with serenity, like someone expecting a visit from old friends. In his later years, he began to record what he saw. He bought a simple notebook and kept it beside the radio, always open. There, he noted each appearance, the time, the shape of the lights, the colors, and even the sensations he felt during each visit. He called it his journal of encounters, and when someone asked, he would just smile and say, "Some things can't be explained, only felt." The story began to spread. Drivers passing the highway said they'd seen the lights too. Some called him crazy, others a prophet, but Jack never argued. He wasn't interested in proving anything. What he'd lived didn't fit into explanations. It belonged to the realm of the invisible, where faith and mystery touch. One night, sitting on the porch, he looked at the sky and murmured to himself, "Fear divides, compassion unites." The phrase came naturally, as if the visitor had planted it inside him. In that instant, the lights flickered on the horizon, soft and shimmering, as if responding to his thought. And Jack felt, for a brief second, the same warmth in his chest he'd known when the being first touched his heart. The radio stayed beside him, faithful as ever. Sometimes it crackled, sometimes it fell silent, but Jack never turned it off. To him, that noise was the living reminder that something extraordinary and that goodness once done never disappears. It just changes form, finds other paths, and returns, like a wave that never tires of reaching the shore. In his final years, Jack stayed on Highway 89, repairing cars, serving coffee, and watching the sky. When asked what kept him there, he answered simply, "Maybe I'm still waiting for the next call for help." And he smiled, that tranquil smile of one who found peace where there had once been only silence. Jack Miller's story wasn't about mystery, nor about visitors from other worlds. It was about humanity, about the power of a simple gesture, extending a hand when someone from anywhere needs help. Because in the end, that's what keeps us connected. The lights continued visiting the desert long after Jack was gone. Some say they still glow on the quietest nights, hovering over the same spot, as if the universe still held respect for that solitary man who chose not to fear. If this story spoke to you, share this video. Leave a comment telling what you feel about encounters that change people's destiny. Your engagement keeps alive the message that goodness, wherever it exists, always finds a way to return.